It's Wednesday, October 16th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett with another installment of the Russell Oral History documentary series produced by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. We're at the Richard B. Russell Building, Special Collections Libraries on the campus of the University of Georgia. I'm joined here in the Bob Shore Oral History Studio by Dan Rumelt. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned a bachelor's degree in political science, and Marquette University, where he earned a master's degree in journalism. During his postgraduate education, Mr. Rumelt also studied at University College at Oxford. After a number of jobs in Madison and Milwaukee, Mr. Rumelt began a lengthy career in the federal government, including stints in the Federal Citizen Information Center, the Office of Special Advisor to the President for Consumer Affairs, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Upon his retirement from government service in 2014, he founded Bluto Group, an online consulting and retail firm. Thank you very much, Mr. Rumelt, for making the trip all the way here from Las Vegas just to sit down and talk to me about,
Glad to do it.
About your career in government and especially media and consumer affairs. So let's start at the beginning. Tell me where you grew up. Like me,
well, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
All right.
A little suburb north of town called Whitefish Bay.
Mm-hmm.
I went to basically what was a college prep type public high school. I think something like 70 or 80% of my graduating class went on to college, and a good chunk of those, probably 30% of that number, went on to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, as I did. I spent 4 years there. My last 2 years, I actually worked in the state legislature as a legislative messenger page, basically.
Sure,
We got a lovely maroon coat, and we helped out the senators and collated bills and all that kind of stuff. And I did that for actually 2.5 years. So that was a great experience.
When would that have been? What was your 4 year?
Probably 71, 72.
Okay, so
in 73. I graduated in 73.
So this would have been a pretty active period on campus for social movements
that
and
was
politics.
The Vietnam War era.
Yeah.
There were bombings and riots. We had the Army Math Research Center there was bombed. I think it was somewhere around 71. That was kind of a wake-up call for people.
I can imagine.
Several semesters we had more class closures than classes. We went to pass-fail at least 1 or 2 semesters during that period, where you weren't in enough classes to really qualify for a grade.
Right.
So they went to a pass-fail system.
Wow.
For 1 semester.
So what attracted you to political science as a major? Was that something you gravitated towards, or something you sort of fell into?
Toward it. I've always had an interest in political processes, and it just seemed like the best match for me. I think as a lot of undergrads, you don't know what you want to do. So I could have gone in a number of different directions, but that's what I chose.
Okay. So, before I forget, Whitefish Bay, is that where the Edmund Fitzgerald was headed before it
that's in Lake Superior.
That's okay, different Whitefish
Yes.
Bay. I was like, I had no idea they were so close to Milwaukee.
Well, it's still a couple hundred miles north of Lake Superior.
Okay. So what was the plan after graduation, such as was there a plan?
I had no plan.
Okay.
I will say that I did gravitate toward journalism when I worked in the state senate.
Okay.
Because I read the coverage and saw the coverage of how things were reported. Well, I was sitting there in the Senate chamber, so I said, these guys don't quite have it right. I think I could do a better job, and that's really what turned me to journalism.
So did you go directly from undergrad into Marquette?
I took a year off because I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do.
Sure.
And I had a variety of jobs. I was a construction laborer. I was an asphalt paver. I worked in a parking lot even before that. The good thing about that is I was making more money than a lot of my friends who went on to traditional careers after they graduated college. So I saved a bunch of money. I lived at home for that year. And then I decided that journalism was for me, and I applied to and was accepted at Marquette University in their graduate program. And I worked under a guy named George Reedy, who probably no one knows his name, but he was I think a big UPI reporter back in the day, and they And when he got near retirement age in journalism, he became dean of the College of Journalism at Marquette University. And he had spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., which is important for our story later on.
I forgot to ask, what did your parents do for a living?
My mother was a homemaker, as so many women were in the 50s and 60s. And my dad worked for Gimbel's, it's a now defunct department.
Macy's and Gimbel's.
Macy's and Gimbel's. My father worked as a merchandise manager. Even back then, Gimbel's, which was headquartered in New York, had stores in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Milwaukee, and my father was assigned to Milwaukee, which is why I grew up there, which became Gimbel's Midwest as they expanded within the
Now, were your folks, was your family originally from New York or out east?
Yes, our whole family is still from New York. Some have migrated as far as New Jersey. You know, they couldn't do it in one fell swoop, so some went to Staten Island before they had the courage to move into a foreign land like New Jersey.
All I'm envisioning is that famous cover of the New Yorker. It's a New Yorker's view of America, and it's.
When my parents decided to move to Milwaukee, the story was that our family was worried that they were going in the wild, wild west and faced all kinds of dangers that you would on a frontier.
Right. Frederick Jackson Turner and that whole thing. That's out in his land, of course. So, tell me, during your time at Marquette, what was your journalistic experience, your real world experience? Did you intern?
I actually worked for the Policemen's Union.
Interesting.
I reported for their paper. And I think my accomplishment there was I had done a lengthy history of the Milwaukee Police Department, which was fascinating because it comes from 1840s, 1850s when it was that was a Wild West at the time in most parts of the country, west of the civilized East.
Right.
So that was interesting, and all the issues that they went through. I actually had an editorial published in the Milwaukee Journal because I did become involved with police issues, and at the time, excuse me, at the time. Police, of course, were tough guys. You never had issues and problems, emotional issues, mental problems, and I tried to uncover what a lot of these issues were that law enforcement people in general face. And at the time, there was a reluctance to seek help because you're a big tough guy, and you didn't.
You're talking about trauma and
and what law enforcement people go through on a daily basis. Where I think there's a lot more acceptance now that. Something traumatic happens on the job, and you seek counseling. You need help to get through it. I'm sure there's still a macho attitude with lots of people, men and women who serve. They're tough and they don't need help. Well, I'm saying, there needs to be programs and a recognition that seeking help is acceptable. If things aren't right with you. I did an editorial on that.
Yeah.
Those are the two things. The other thing I did while I was at Marquette is I got involved in what I believe became sort of the landmark witness victim study. I worked in courts. Interviewing victims and crime witnesses, and it was the beginning of the programs where what do we do for crime victims and witnesses to help them through the process.
Right.
Because there hadn't been much attention paid to that back this was in the 70s.
Wow. Yeah.
So my understanding was that became sort of the basis for a lot of the programs that evolved to help crime victims and witnesses. I did that for about a year, and it was fascinating.
Well, you're doing this stuff in the 1970s, and we're still having developments, especially in the area of victim rights. Here in Georgia, we have something called Marcy's Law, where victims have certain rights from the courts and the district attorney's office have to follow certain rules. So, is that something, while you're doing this work, especially with the police union and sort of mental health, I guess, for lack of a better term, was that something that you were sort of envisioning as a career, or
No.
you mentioned
A friend of mine got involved in that program, and I said, that sounds really interesting. I want to do that. So I pestered them until they hired me. And it was just fascinating to me. I didn't envision going into law enforcement or anything like that, but I was fascinated by it, and I was glad to be a part of maybe what has led to programs to help victims and witnesses.
So how do you make the career leap from what you're doing in Milwaukee to, you know, 30 plus years in Washington, D.C.?
Because of the way I was working construction and as a longshoreman, it put me out of sync with the graduate program.
Okay.
So I wound up needing 3 graduate credits. I guess this would have been 1974 or 5.
Okay.
And I said, you know, instead of taking my 3 credits here and working part-time for a newspaper or the policeman's union or whatever it would be, I'm going to try and get an internship in Washington, D.C. I envisioned myself at the time starting in journalism and then working into the public affairs arena, public communications, things like that. So I basically got on a plane. I had a friend who lived in Washington, D.C., visited her, and back in the day there was no internet, so how do you find opportunities? Well, I had a phone book, and I went through it, and I went federal agencies and NGOs and nonprofits, and one day I wandered upon what was then the Health, Education, and Welfare Office of Consumer Services. And a lot of places said, thank you very much, thanks for stopping by. These guys said, oh, come on in, let's talk to our, one of our office manager. I forget the title. And I said, here's my deal. I'll work for you 20 hours a week for free, and you work it out with Marquette University so I get graduate credit for this. And they said yes. So I said, great. So I went back home, packed up my stuff, had no money, had no car. I got one of these cars that needed to be, it was repossessed, it was needed in North Carolina. So I worked it out with them that I could pack up all my stuff in his car, moved to Washington, D.C. I lived in the apartment of a friend of mine who was off working on a political campaign. So I had a place to stay in Annandale, Virginia. And then I dropped off my stuff, drove this car to North Carolina, and they gave me a bus ticket for the 10-hour ride back to the Washington, D.C. area where I had to drop his car off at a bank. So that's how I got started. And I did my 20 hours a week. What it turned out, this Office of Consumer Services actually turned out to be the support staff for the special advisor to the president for consumer affairs.
Right.
So it was essentially a White House office. And this woman, Virginia Nauer, who was the special advisor to the president for consumer affairs, had assembled a staff that's much larger than most comparable offices in the White House have. And so they needed, at the White House level, this was under President Ford, Gerald Ford at the time, they needed to, I'm going to say, rein her in from developing this empire. So they said, what we're going to do is merge your office with the existing HEW, Office of Consumer Services. And you will, you can't take on any more staff. I think there was like 52 people altogether.
That's a big office.
Divisions.
That's a big office.
Normally an advisor maybe has a half a dozen people.
Yeah.
And you work on policy and you do all, well, she had this empire. And she leapfrogged with another woman, Esther Peterson, who served under Democratic presidents. And I think the office originated, or at least the special advisor position originated with Esther Peterson under President Johnson.
Yeah.
So then as a Republican president took over, then Virginia Nauer would be in that position. And then when Jimmy Carter came in, for instance, Esther Peterson came back, and they did this up until I think the office or the position ceased to exist under the Clinton administration. So I started working for this office. I started working for the Office of Consumer Service. Well, I learned it was the Office of the Special Advisor to the President for Consumer Affairs. So we would be shuttled from this office in the HEW building on a daily basis over to the older new executive office building where the boss was. So it was a much higher level than I had envisioned.
Yeah.
The office had a radio program, they had a news column, and a weekly or twice monthly newsletter. So I helped out on all these things. I became a speechwriter, did everything that a public affairs, media relations person would do. So then we had Jimmy Carter, who defeated Gerald Ford, and the top people in the office, of course, were political appointees.
Right.
They're gone.
Right.
The director of the office, career guy, said to me, you know all this stuff. Can you stay on until the new people come in? So as a contractor, I had no job. I finished my last 3 credits. I did have in lieu of a thesis, it was called a professional project, and I had to take written comprehensive exams for that.
Oh, yes.
So I figured, well, I'll work that in. Wound up taking me 8 years to do. And I was within days of my 3rd and final extension to get my master's. It was 1983 or something. It took me like 8 years to do this. But I did get my master's. But, you know, I had a full-time job. I had some health issues. It gave me the opportunity to postpone. And I'm a chronic procrastinator anyway, so it was real easy to keep this thing going for years and years and years. But I did finally get it. But so anyway, they put me on as a contractor, and with the idea that I would at least stay on until the new political people came in. Well, the new political people came in, but they were more concerned at the time with establishing a federal consumer protection agency. Even today in the federal government, it's split up. There's no central.
Right.
You have the Financial Bureau, you've got the FTC, you've got Consumer Product Safety Commission, where I later worked. You have all these agencies that National Highway Traffic Safety Administration,
The Consumer
and scattered
Financial,
into different agencies. So they wanted to consolidate, and they failed, but it got me more entrenched in this office doing the day-to-day stuff. So when they came in, they needed help, and I had handled some of these functions. So all of a sudden, I found myself as a federal employee, which I didn't intend to do. I'm glad it worked out that way. And going to the end, I looked at my watch one day, and 36 years had passed, and I retired from the federal government in 2014. So I can't believe how long I've been out. I don't think you mentioned there. My last 14 years was in the Federal Communications.
Oh yeah. Well, we're gonna we're gonna get there.
All right.
So
Okay.
you mentioned the Carter presidency, and the consumer rights movement was really in full swing. And you had this was during the period where corporate lobbying was not really up to where it is today in terms of K Street beefing up, largely in response to these federal efforts that were going on. How did your day-to-day job change in consumer affairs either under the Carter administration, the Reagan administration? Ideologically, these are two very different presidents. How much did that trickle down to a career person like you?
I would say when Republicans were in charge, there'd be more emphasis on cooperative programs with industry to resolve consumer complaints and things like that. The Democrats came in, there may have been more of an emphasis on the regulatory side of things. And both are important, and I think for the most part, at the time, there was a pretty good balance. I think the people who favored more regulations would say it's skewed toward business, and the business side would say, well, it's skewed toward all these regulators and all this stuff. Well, you really need both, I think, to succeed. So that would be probably the main difference in approach from whomever's in charge.
Now, you mentioned the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
Yes.
You moved over to that organization in 1986 or so.
Yes, I did a stint first at the General Services Administration, the Consumer Information Center, they used to have a catalog where they compiled all the information and brochures and things from consumer protection related agencies and made it available through a distribution center in Colorado. That it's now this, I believe it's still there, as the Citizens Information Center, and I'm sure a lot of it's online and digital now. But at the time, we published a catalog and we put brochures together, and it was basically a marketing position. My job there was to work with federal agencies to which I was assigned as sort of a marketing rep to get their information materials into the program, and in some cases actually help them develop materials that we thought would be useful to the public in their area of interest, whatever.
So actually something more in line with what you had originally envisioned for your
well, it was
your
more marketing than writing and
Sure.
developing information materials. And from that position, I then became Deputy Director of Public Affairs at the Consumer Product Safety Commission, where for many years I was the spokesperson on product recalls. And it was rewarding because, I often wonder, well, how many little kids are alive today or are uninjured today because of the information on recalls and product safety that we disseminated to the public.
Right. I have to think that if Americans think about the product safety commission at all, they think about it in terms of recalls. And were there any recalls that really stand out in your mind that had all hands on deck, or that was something out of the ordinary than
some of the problem areas were electric heaters that maybe weren't made to code or standards that would cause fires. One of our issue areas was pool safety and trying to come up with fencing and pool covers, because you've got a 3-year-old
falling on pool
and
covers.
The idea was have a layered approach. So you want a door the kid can't get out, then you want to have to get through a gate of some kind that they can't open, and then for much of the year in many parts of the country you have a pool cover on it. So it was a layered approach. So I worked with that industry closely. Those are the two that come to mind. Of course, there's hundreds of areas.
Oh, sure, sure.
Cribs, for instance. Back in the day, decorative cribs had corner posts. They called them finials, I believe. And you would have kids falling out of the crib and getting a suspender caught on the corner of the crib and strangled. So some parent would come in and see their kid hung. So I was involved with, of course, informing people, if you want to keep that crib, saw off the finials and make it safer for kids. And part of the reason we had a lot of these problems is no one knew about them. Kids would go to hospitals, there wouldn't be recorded, well, how did this person die, or how did they get this injury? Well, they set up a national system for compiling all this data through the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and they found out, well, wow, there's crib deaths, and there's heater fires, and there's all this stuff. And so we were able, not me, but I was part of the process for developing systems for identifying injuries and deaths, the causes of them, and then working with the companies to recall the products or make them differently, and to help develop standards so that future products would not have some of these issues. Maybe it was a stroller that would collapse on a kid. They're made today so that they're less likely to do that kind of thing.
Now, you touched on something earlier about maybe the balance of regulation and business interests, the profit motive. But what you're describing is a much more, I think, collaborative approach with not so much a dictates, but a give and take between these companies, these industries, and the government regulators that you represented or worked for. Right. Is that a correct impression that I'm coming away with?
Yeah, I would say so. But it's not just two-sided. You have other interest groups. You have consumer groups. You have lobbying groups separate from individual companies. You have industry associations.
Sure.
So you really have issues from a lot of different corners where people, have different perspectives, and hopefully the system works so that you get a balance where there's not over-regulation, but then there's not rampant safety issues or consumer problems with products and services. So
Now,
balance is important.
do you go into like flashback mode every time you see a recall on the news, or it pops up in the newspaper?
Not so much, but I did have a political boss, and I think in myself I had the same issue. We would go to a friend's house and say, you shouldn't have that extension cord along there. And you really need to put something in an outlet so your 2-year-old doesn't lick it and get electrocuted.
Right.
And I remember one boss in particular, like his friends didn't invite him over probably because everything he looked at, he would talk about how it's a hazard. And,
Oh, I'm sure.
and I was like that to a certain extent.
Well, I think anybody, you spend enough time doing that you're just a heightened sense of awareness of those issues.
I should say that. The other interesting thing about that position is, political people come and go, sometimes
Right.
every few months. So in my position, I believe I spent more time as acting director than I did in my deputy role.
And what did that mean day to day difference?
That means as deputy, I managed the staff.
Right.
But when I didn't have a boss, I managed the staff and I was the spokesperson on camera with newspapers, talking about latest recalls or product safety advice. We had initiatives throughout the year, like 4th of July, we would talk about fireworks safety
Right.
and how not to blow your hand off, and please be careful. And we actually would blow up a dummy every year. I don't know if that's
I remember, yes.
Yeah, so we would have this dummy out there with a firework device, and it would go off, and the dummy's head would fly off and catch fire. So frighten people into safe behavior.
Frightened me.
Yeah,
It worked.
So we did that, and in auto safety, you had the crash dummies. This was not my direct area, but you would have the crash dummies if you remember hitting the dash and all that.
Remember the crash test dummies? Wow.
So anyway.
So how did you make the career transition in the mid late '80s from Consumer Product Safety Commission to, as you mentioned, the Federal Communications Commission?
The core area was media relations and developing public information materials, video, radio. So while the issues changed, really, I was the process guy.
Right.
I did learn,
Right.
the product safety issues, and then I learned the communications issues. So that was, it was more getting the message out and developing messages than, that was my area of expertise.
As opposed to the technical specifications of this, that,
We
and
had
the other.
engineers, who both at the Consumer Product Safety Commission and at the FCC, who were very good at explaining stuff that I had no way of understanding and helping me develop materials that regular people could understand, and that was the key.
So as a process guy, how did your work differ from the FCC from Consumer Product Safety Commission? Was there a culture difference, an approach difference, or was it really just going from one public affairs firm to the other?
Both. A lot of the
That's the
stuff
best
was
answer. I love
the
that.
same, but it was just the issues. I went from how do we get the message about this electric heater problem versus at the time cell phones were developing. How does the public understand these services so they know what to buy with knowledge that they're getting the right thing, and things were really evolving when I was there, because
Yeah.
we still had the big bulky computer monitors. We didn't have flat screens back then. But I started at the FCC sort of in this general capacity.
Okay.
And I did get involved with the transition to digital television. If you remember, somewhere around 2009, we pulled the plug on analog television went to digital. Well, that was going to be an issue for a lot of people who still had the old TVs with rabbit ears on them. And there was a substantial number of people nationwide who were going to lose their signal. So I became involved in our program, and I was on the road for about a year and a half.
Yeah.
Where I was assigned a region with a team of people to go out and work with broadcasters and retailers and public interest groups and social service offices to get materials out. On this date, the plug is going to get pulled, and if you don't have a digital TV, you're going to need a converter box.
Right.
You may remember there was a coupon program. You could get $40 off on a converter box that you could plug into your TV and receive the digital signal and convert it to analog so you could watch it on your TV. So our job was to try and make sure that as few people as possible lost their signal on that date. And I also participated in a program in North Carolina, which was a pilot program. Let's see what works in getting the public to know about what's going to happen. And we learned a lot from that, which we then applied to different regions around the country.
Was that the region you were assigned to?
I was in the region, it was on DMAs, designated market areas, and mine went from Illinois to Idaho.
That's
and
a big
down
area.
through the Dakotas, Iowa, Illinois, Iowa, kind of northwest. But it
Okay.
was based on these designated areas. And
Okay.
that was mine. And we had about maybe 20 people in that region alone. And Congress was annoyed with us because our leadership at the FCC at the time didn't really think that was our job. Well, Congress told us it was our job. So we worked with, I was like a salesman for a while.
Sounds like
I
it.
had like brochures and information and coupon applications in my car. And I would drive through rural areas of North Carolina and later in Montana and visit Social Security offices and local government offices, and we'd work with fire departments in helping to get this information out.
So I think a lot, at least when I thought about this digital transition and people who stood to lose their signal, I think of rural areas. But this is probably maybe more of a class issue than the geographic issue. Or was it maybe a demographic
I will
issue with
say,
older folks?
Obviously, low-income people were more affected. When we worked in a number of counties in North Carolina, in the pilot, it was during the Great Recession, which was coming. And there were a lot of people whose hours were cut back in factories and elsewhere, and they had to give up cable, or they had to give up the dish, as they called it. So our job was, and they knew that they couldn't afford, at the time, a small flat screen TV could have been, $600.
Yeah.
Remember, now it's like $199.
Yeah.
You can get a decent
Or
TV.
less.
So they were looking for ways to economize, and one way was to go with the converter box and antenna option over the air than to keep the service. So that it's basically an income issue at the time. I don't remember the number. I think there were maybe up to 20 million people who would be affected.
Wow.
And I worked in Chicago. We'd go into inner city housing projects with local authorities and have community meetings telling people about this and helping them make sure that they didn't get left out when the plug got pulled on analog TV. And in Montana, we work with, on Tuesday nights, they would come up with lists of people who needed help, and we'd go into an elderly woman's home with a broadcast, maybe a station manager, and a lot of these broadcasters and companies donated converter boxes. So we'd go into some elderly woman's home who had the 12-inch TV with the rabbit ears, who was really afraid of losing her window to the world. And we'd plug it in, and she got, even on an analog TV, you get a better picture often. You may get fewer channels because of the physics of how the signals get out there. But you know, the people were in tears. We would leave, and they knew they would not lose their little window to the world. They'd have walkers. They would rarely leave their apartment, and this little 12-inch box was how they were connected to the world. So that was really rewarding to be part of that.
Now, when the signal was finally, the plug was pulled in 2009, but stations were making the transition.
Yes.
Because I grew up in Southern Illinois, and one of my friends, his parents, Steve and Bonnie Wheeler, ran WSIL TV down in Southern Illinois, and I can remember. Maybe it's a false memory, I don't know. We were over at his house the night they made the transition. It was right after the 10 o'clock news, and the channel switched. And this would have been maybe 2002, 2003. So stations were changing. So it really was.
Well, you just don't pull the plug. You got to have everything in place.
Right.
So, but keep in mind too, a lot of people did have satellite. A lot of people had
sure.
cable who already had the digital signal. Coming into their homes. But a lot of people did not.
Right.
That was the issue. I would spend afternoons at a retailer, and because it was in the interests of broadcasters, getting coverage was easy. I remember, I think it was Montana, they had like a 2 o'clock news briefing and a 4 o'clock and a 6 o'clock, and we'd get on camera and we would talk about these issues because it was in the broadcaster's interest and the retailer's interest.
Sure.
So I remember spending countless hours in electronics retailers, hosting people who would come in. You know, come on in. You know, we're open. We're here till 8 o'clock, and get your coupons and learn about the converter boxes. So when we weren't on air, we'd be talking to people who were coming in. It was like a carnival almost. And I did that for a year and a half.
Wow. So tell me about your work you did with tribal communities.
After the digital transition, we developed basically a policy office for Native Affairs at the Federal Communications Commission. And I wanted to be a part of that. So I spent my last several years at the FCC visiting Alaska Native villages and the reservations around the country to figure out how tribal nations could take advantage of modern communications. And it was the era had started, but it was the era when if you didn't have internet access, it's hard to buy stuff, it's hard to deal with financial institutions. If you're an entrepreneur, you needed an internet presence. Well, how do you get that into really rural and remote areas where no phone company can make enough money to bring internet to? In the city of Chicago, you got millions of people.
Right.
You know, you got thousands of people per square mile. You got 12 people, maybe in some rural area. Who's going to, in their right mind, set up a business to provide a signal? So what do? Well, you have programs where you pay a monthly fee, and it's shared among a larger area. These Lifeline programs, you hear, the names change all the time. But at the time, Lifeline for phone service, and then extended to internet access, to make sure that rural areas had the same type of advanced access to communication services as most of us expect and do have in more urbanized areas. So that was very rewarding as well.
Was that sort of a, it's sort of a similar issue, with cable companies, for example. If you live in a rural area, your access to cable is and to your point, the profit mode it just isn't there.
Well, someone's got to come up. And first of all, there's no one size fits all. You have affluent tribes who can set up their own phone companies.
Sure.
They can do a partnership with a provider. So there's countless ways of doing this. And what works in rural Montana is not going to work in Alaska or some other part of the country. So the challenge was, what could we do on a federal level to facilitate getting signal and services to these areas?
Now, what do you think the successes were, and what are the challenges? You know, obviously it's been 10 or so years since you've done this. What challenges do these communities, the tribal communities, still face?
Wow. Well, poverty is a persistent problem in rural areas, and more so, I think, in reservations and in tribal nations. So I think the economics just makes it a lot harder
Right.
to bring these kind of services to people. So that doesn't go away. But you know, the need for these services is only getting the need is still there. That hasn't gone away. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you better have a website and good signal
Right.
To reach potential customers, not just in their immediate area, but around the country and around the world. There's a lot of challenges, and you know, I've been out of this for 10 years now. So what the challenges are now are probably a lot different than they were when I left 10 years ago.
Well, and I guess, you know, something I'll talk with Kathy about is rural broadband, and she dealt with rural broadband from the perspective of the USDA.
Yes.
You know, when I think of rural broadband, I think of FCC and federal community. Did you have any sort of overlap with rural broadband efforts?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, remember the FCC was the regulator.
Right.
The USDA is more on the program side of it. They would have to conform to whatever the regulations were. So that would be the difference.
Okay.
Yeah, we work with rural areas, more of an emphasis on tribal areas. USDA had its part, of course.
I guess commerce would have been involved.
Different part of the same story.
Right. I guess it's just it's fascinating to think about all the different, you know, disparate and spread out efforts, rather than when I think when a lot of folks, it's like the government, they think of some big consolidated monolith, and what we're talking about here is actually all these different providers, maybe an umbrella regulator in the FCC.
But that's true in other areas. To take intelligence community.
Perfect example.
Defense Department.
Perfect
you got
example.
NSA, you got the CIA, and probably a lot of places we don't even know about. And somehow they managed to coordinate.
Right.
Same thing in other areas, whether it's food or health care or education. It's not all in one place. And then you work with states, you know, so that's another aspect.
Now, one program that I guess was more towards the beginning of your time at the FCC was the federal do not call list.
Right.
That's something I remember, and it was maybe I remember it as it was going to be the silver bullet that finally did away with. And tell me about that process in developing it, rolling it out, maybe the challenges.
Well, the challenges are that you can identify someone who's doing this and go after them, and then they change the number and move. So, you know, it's kind of like plugging the holes in the dam. You know, you're going all over the place. It's hard to stop. I mean, I know, put me on your do not call list. If you say that, I believe you have a better chance than just hanging up or, you know, uttering some obscenity to show your displeasure. That they can keep calling you. And then it doesn't apply to political calls, for instance. There are exceptions. So you just have to tolerate it. I get very few calls now, but I did get, for a long, long time, you probably did too, but help with your student loans and your extended warranty on your car.
I also won a lot of cruises.
Oh yeah, I get a lot of travel stuff. You know, and they'll say, "Well, you must have signed up for something or filled out a coupon." I said, "I never signed up for anything. I didn't fill out a coupon. Put me on your do not call list." I believe you'll have more success with that. They know you're serious, that you're not going to buy anything. And I've told them, I don't want to waste your time. There's no point in calling me again. I'm never going to buy whatever it is you're selling. And I don't have student loans. And I have an extended car warranty on my new car. I don't need you for many, many years. Don't call me. And we own some residential rental properties, so we're always getting calls. Hey, you going to sell this property? No, I don't want to sell this property. I've had mixed success.
Right. Well,
But it's a moving target. You know, how do you get these guys? Even with laws in place,
Right.
You know, how do you get them?
well, you know, over the span of your career, how did, at the end of the day, what you're talking about is interpersonal communications.
Yeah.
How did the approach change? Did the media change from when you began back in the Ford administration up through the
Well, then
Obama?
it was you print a brochure. We had something called video news releases, which are long gone now, where we would have a principal in a room and we would arrange for TV stations to call in and do a live interview with the chairman of the FCC.
It sounds very quaint.
And that's all gone now. You know, now it's, social media is really where people get their information.
Had it already made that transition when you?
No. It was just starting.
Just starting. So
Starting.
it seems like that, the civil service, the government bureaucrats sort of get a bad rap. I don't. Maybe they need a marketing team of their own. Do you think it's more difficult now to be a government employee than it was back when you were?
I think we're more polarized. I think there's a more negative view of the federal government now when you hear about the deep state and the administrative state and all this stuff. We hear with hurricanes, FEMA, people are being threatened. That's
I've seen
a
that.
little bit crazy to me. But even back in the day when it wasn't as polarized, we had in our regions federal vehicles, and people had the option of not having a U.S. government license plate if they were concerned that would attract negative attention. So I think the problems become more intense, but the problem's always been there.
This is not a fair question, of course, but how does it get better? How do you think that situation can be improved?
I think somehow, I don't know how it happens, we need to respect other people and their views. And we've started to treat people who don't agree with us as enemies. I think it was Senator Bob Dole who once said, he's my opponent, not my enemy, in referring to an election. I think he said that before the election and when he lost after the election. So we need that attitude. And once the voting's done, you got to sit down and say, how do we all work together instead of I won, I'm going to dominate you, and my views will prevail, and I'll do what I want. So we need to sit down with the people who lost elections and figure out how you work together. Or if you're a minority party, you got to work with them. Otherwise, we're just not going to move forward, I don't think.
Well, what message would you have to young people or maybe people who are just starting their career or starting a new career and thinking about a career in government service, from somebody who took sort of an indirect, maybe unorthodox approach to getting there?
First, I would say get an internship somewhere. And I started as an intern. So I mentored many people throughout my career and helped them get jobs and make career changes. And I said, the best way to get a job is to go work for somebody. Get money from your parents, do a part-time job, figure out how to get some experience, whether it's in government or in the private sector or in the nonprofit sector. But you got to get real-world experience to augment whatever education you have. So I am a very, very strong advocate of internship programs and on-the-job training. But you got to get out there and you got to meet people. I only got to where I was and looked at my watch and found out I'd been in the federal government for 36 years because, I made contact. It's all about networking. and it's all about applying your skills. And someone's going to say, you know, we didn't hire this guy as an employee, but he or she's really good. We should find a place for them. And that's how a lot of people, young people, I think especially, can get involved and it may shape their careers. You know, I don't know where you started, but
I started as an
probably,
intern in this library.
Okay. But it could have taken a much different turn, and maybe
Absolutely.
it hasn't gone the way you envisioned it. I certainly didn't expect to be a federal employee for 36 years, but I was a rewarding career for me, and you move the ball forward. And I've been to events. There's a public service recognition week that I used to participate in, and you'd usually have people from both parties talking about why you would want to do this, because it can be extremely frustrating. And whatever your issue is, you want to try and move the ball forward. The important thing is that you tried, whether it's food insecurity, or if it's health care or housing or whatever it is. You got to be in there fighting and try, and you can have your own goals. You may never succeed, but the messages from leaders is the important thing is trying. The important thing is to try and move that ball forward. If you have a personal goal or a mission, you work toward that, and you may never achieve it, but the point is you tried to.
Right. Well, you looked down at your watch. It had been 36 years. You decided to call it a day, call it a career. But what have you been up to in those 10 years
First,
since?
let me explain why I decided.
Yeah, please.
My time was up. I tell people I didn't get burned out, but I did get worn out, because for many of my years in government, I was among the top career people with the political people above me, and there's a natural friction.
Sure.
And that just wears you down over time. And I think my last year in federal service, I was not very productive, because I just had it. I quite frankly, I wasn't functioning very well, as I'd worn down. And finally I said, well, this is it. So I've been out of that for 10 years. Now we pursue travel. I have this little online retail store that I don't tend to because we travel so much. I did some consulting for a while. I worked for a company that provided meals to service people on bases, and I did that for about a year and then moved on. But I think our travel and normal retirement activities keep us so busy that I don't know how I worked and maintained my lifestyle, because we're really busy now, my wife and I.
Yeah.
And it's hard just doing our retirement stuff. And like, how did we, work a 40-plus hour a week job for those years and, try and have a side life as well? So I'm busy, but I'm not working in the traditional sense.
Well, neither here nor there, but I guess a piece of trivia. Where's your favorite places to travel and?
We love Hawaii.
Oh, well.
We're big cruisers.
Okay.
We probably go on 4 or more cruises per year.
Wow.
As short as 3 days, as long as 40 days. So we get around. We have probably, if you add up all the nights we've been at sea, it's probably, I know it's over a year.
Oh, wow.
It's like
Wow.
maybe 400 nights that we've been at sea. All, from Antarctica to New Zealand. We took a 16-day cruise around the top of Australia. And I think people need to get around the country and around the world. You have a much better understanding, and you have much greater tolerance and understanding of other people and their lifestyles and their cultures. You live with your own people, and you think that's the only way to live. You got to get out there and see how other people live, and I think that would be better for all of us if we had an understanding of how people live in places that are quite different. We took a safari trip to Central and Southern Africa. I mean, life is a lot different there, and yet
Imagine.
many people are happy, and they love what they do, and they're loyal to their nations and their culture, and we need to have an understanding and respect for that. And that's something that I think has gone away in recent years as we've become more polarized. My side is right, man, your side is wrong. Well, when you have a 50.1% majority, you're not the boss. I mean, you got to deal with that other 49.9% of people. That's unfortunately our country has sort of gone in that direction. I hope we pull back. Pendulums go from one extreme to the other, and you're usually best when you're just in the center, just left or right of it. And pendulums always swing back.
Right. Things are always changing, so nothing lasts forever anyway.
I think that's a lot of people's problems. They want it to be the way it was, and it never is. And of course, you have a rather romantic view of how it was 40 years ago. Well, going back there could be the worst thing for you and your family and the country. But
well, I think this. You've imparted a lot of life lessons that I think people can probably take a lot from. Is there anything else you'd like to record for posterity, or any other free tips you'd like to pass out?
Just to reiterate, get life experience, volunteer somewhere, work for nothing if you have to, because if you've got the skills, and I think one of the things I'm concerned about is we're losing interpersonal communication skills. Just coming here today, people walking and watching their phones. I think we're all spending too much screen time. You're forgetting how to speak with people, to communicate with people, and a lot of people are getting run over because they've got their phone there, and maybe the guy in the car is texting, and this is not a good thing. You got people falling over cliffs because they're taking selfies and they're backing up too far. So I think we may be doing too much screen time. And I hear there's some young people who are saying, let's get away from this. You know more about that than I do.
Well, yeah, I have a 9-year-old, and we just had this conversation last night. You can look at it's like anything else. The doctor's recommendations, the pediatric recommendations change fairly often, but it's to the point where it's maybe 2 hours a week of screen time. And I remember growing up in the 80s and early 90s, and you just plopped in front of the TV. Yeah. But there does seem to be something different physiologically, psychologically with the screens, these small screens, the all-encompassing screens. But yeah, and you hear it with educators who are concerned that students don't have the endurance to read entire books, to engage in meaningful class discussions, and what part that social media plays in that, what part screen time plays in that. Obviously, there are lots of great social scientists who are going to do, and psychologists who are going to do lots of research on that. But it's amazing how quickly things have changed since the first smartphones rolled out in 2008, 2009, 2010,
right,
to now, and that's not really that long of a time if you think about it.
Well, I think that leads to another problem: is people believe what they see on their screens. My advice would be, don't believe anything. Fact check everything. I was at a conference recently where Prince Harry, of all people, was the spokesperson, and I didn't know this, but one of the many things he does is he's a leader in internet security and child safety, and he put up a very telling graphic. He had behind him posters, screenshots of children, hundreds of them, who had died because of internet activity. Maybe they met up with a predator, maybe they committed suicide because of bullying and harassment and that sort of thing. And I don't know what the solution is, but we have to address that issue. And I think one reason we're so polarized, we believe what we see. And you only read what you're comfortable with, what you're used to.
Or what the algorithm has shaped for
but you don't go to see what other people are saying. So you believe it, and that's the truth, and that's the reality, and that other guy's is not. So I guess, and as a journalist, I'm trained, you fact check.
Right.
You think, really? Did that take place? I look it up, and maybe it did, and most likely it didn't, or it was taken out of context and distorted. So and I think we need to teach this in our schools too, is like, you're going to be bombarded with information from all sources. Don't believe any of it. Back in my day, you had 3 or 4 networks, and you had Walter Cronkite, and you had, Huntley and Brinkley,
and Roger Mudd,
and they told you the truth every night, right? And you didn't have 100 different sources of information. You had like 4 in your local newspaper. And it was easier to sort out facts. Now you've got perspectives and sources of information that sound legitimate that are maybe not. Yeah. And you hear about, Russia's the source of this information, or Iran or China. And we need to figure out how to sort that out and not accept some other person's truth. So fact check everything.
Yeah, we were talking about this, and I kept thinking about how much of your job was putting in front of people, families, consumers, information that was factual, that they would believe and consume and hopefully apply. And what you've described is a situation where we have now where information illiteracy or digital literacy is such a problem, in that, you have, I'm Dan Rumelt, I'm from the U.S. government. People,
And I'm here to help.
And people might, it's like, well, I've read on this, or I saw this YouTube video. And I think the point you made about, this probably has to be taught a lot, and we haven't even talked about generative AI and what that can, but right, I mean, that's a whole other, can of worms, but, this has to be probably implemented at the elementary school level of, why is this news less trustworthy? What are the red flags? You think about all those cybersecurity trainings you used to take on, how do you spot a spam email or a phishing scam? And maybe that's something that happens.
You have the tools, I think, where you could fix that. If I were the information czar, and I would be a benevolent dictator if I were in charge, as you would too, but a lot of people wouldn't. So I would set up the algorithms so every message you received would have like a red, yellow, green icon. And the red one would indicate this is totally false. And give it links to the information that confirm it. A yellow one would say, it's truth, but it's taken out of context so that you will believe what's being said, and yet if you look at the whole picture, it's not true. In green would be the algorithm would say, this appears to be legitimate and real. And I think we need tools like that. And I don't think it's that far-fetched that we can do that. So that you would know that this crazy podcaster is, you get the yellow, it'd go red, yellow, green, depending on what's being said. And I think we've got the tools to do that now.
Right.
You just have to trust the guy to set them up so that it's neutral and unbiased, which I think you can do with technology better than we can do as human beings.
Well, and the technology will be implemented by career civil service folks.
Many of whom are not trusted at the moment. But, we have to restore trust in our institutions.
Right.
In my opinion, having worked for the federal government, there's not a deep state out to get you. There are dedicated men and women who are trying to make life better for people. And how we've gotten to a situation where FEMA workers feel threatened trying to help hurricane victims because someone is claiming that they're out to rip them off or take advantage of them is ludicrous. And to have people believe it is, quite frankly, frightening.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for a wide-ranging.
We covered a lot more than my
we cover a lot of
career.
ground here in these oral histories, but no, this was fascinating, and thanks for giving us that first-person perspective into your work.
Well, I hope people will watch this and will say, that's a good point. I maybe should question the information I get, or as a young person, I should, send myself to Europe, which is what I did when I went to Oxford. I said,
Right.
I'm going to do something different. I went to this program in Oxford, meeting people from all over the world, or get that internship, or take the initiative, go to Washington D.C. or wherever you think you would be happy, and just find the people. You can do it. A lot of people just don't know that they can do this.
Right.
But you got to get out there. Put yourself out there. That would be my best message to people.
A great message, and we'll leave it there. Dan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.